Um, so I'm going to welcome everybody today to our presentation with Dr. Watson. I'm so happy to have her here today to speak about learning disabilities and ADHD. Dr. Watson and I have been working together for many years now, getting to know one another through the San Diego branch of the International Dyslexia Association, and then working together as she assesses students for learning disabilities and attention deficit challenges. And then we work to support those students. So I'm very happy to have her here today to share her incredible knowledge with you all. I will pass it on to you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, so I'm Christina Watson. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work specifically with kids that have learning disabilities and ADHD, and adults as well, with assessment and diagnosis. So I have been doing this work since the year 2000, and I've been exclusively testing without any kind of therapy or other aspects to my business since 2005. So I am excited to be here, and I really appreciate you signing on. And Megan, I appreciate you asking me to be here. So I think, as Megan mentioned, at the end of each section, you can ask questions. Actually, you'll be putting those in the chat, and Megan will be moderating that and asking the questions. So, for example, I'm going to talk about ADHD. So then you'll put those ADHD related questions in the chat, and then I'll answer those before we move on to the next topic. Okay, so hopefully that's nice and clear. So today we're going to cover the terms disability, disorder, and difference. So you're going to hear that here and there. So you'll hear learning disability, learning disorder, learning difference. What does that mean, right? Like, why do we have these three different things that people say? We're also going to talk about ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, nonverbal learning disorder, and then other causes of learning struggles. So these are kind of the main diagnoses that you'll encounter when kids are having difficulty in school. They're the most common causes. And so that's why we're going to be talking about those. So let's start off with, hold on a second. For some reason, I have a strange thing happening. Okay. So disability. So disability is a legal term that allows for a student to receive services. So for example, let's say that you want your child to be able to get services under an IEP, then that term will be disability. So it'll be a specific learning disability that gets your child services, because that is the term that is used in the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and the 504 Act as well. So those are legal terms. Disorder is a medical term. So that is found in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. And it is in that book, the DSM-5, that you'll see specific learning disorder. So I might diagnose a child with a specific learning disorder out of the DSM-5, and that's saying that they have this condition that causes them impairment in their functioning, but they may not actually meet Ed Code criteria for a disability that gets them an IEP. Okay, so that is something that can be sort of difficult to understand sometimes. If your child has a diagnosis, why can they not get services through the school district? Well, their impairment may not be severe enough, and they may not meet those specific educational codes to have a disability under the law. So hopefully that makes some sense. Difference is, if you're learning difference, that's going to be a term that's more used out kind of in the community, amongst lay people, and those of us that are servicing individuals that have challenges with learning. We'll often say learning difference because there's really just an acknowledgement that the human brain is so vastly different, right? One to the other. Every single person learns differently. And just because you learn one way shouldn't necessarily be considered pathological, and another more normal, right? Whereas the terms disability and disorder can sort of have a connotation to them. There's something really wrong with that person's learning. So each term can be used in the specific context where it applies. So in an IEP meeting, you want to say disability. In the pediatrician's office, you probably want to say disorder. And then with your child, you would want to say difference, right? It's usually not beneficial to use disability or disorder with a child. They don't really understand anything about that, except that sounds like something's wrong with them, right? So we just want to probably focus on saying learning difference with kids. These terms outside of those kinds of settings can be used interchangeably, and I have no doubt that I will use all three of them today. I just say whatever comes out. Sometimes I say disability, sometimes I say disorder, sometimes I say difference. So whatever you feel most comfortable with, and maybe what you feel best describes your own child's experience in terms of it, it really is disabling. Like this is their dyslexia, for example, is very disabling. Then you might want to say, my child has a learning disability, right? And if you feel like your child's difficulty is more kind of in the realm of moderate, like yes, there's some impairment for sure, but it's not super, super severe, then, maybe you'll say my child has a learning disorder. And then most often you probably say your child has a learning difference. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit. Okay. Now let's jump right into ADHD. So ADHD versus ADD. So you're going to hear the term ADD out in the world, but yet when your child receives a diagnosis, it's going to be ADHD. And sometimes that's very confusing for parents because they say, well, my child doesn't have hyperactivity. My child's sitting very still and isn't impulsive at all. So why are you saying ADHD? Because they don't have the H. Right. And it used to be that ADD was a perfectly accurate diagnosis, but now the medical term is ADHD, no matter what the presentation is. So there's just subtypes of ADHD. So the first subtype is predominantly inattentive presentation, and that is what we would call ADD. Okay, so ADD is going to be more of a nickname now, sort of for child or the adult has enough symptoms of inattention to diagnose ADHD, but they don't have enough symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity to say that they have another subtype of ADHD. So these are just the kind of daydreamy, disorganized, inattentive kids or adults. They're not really super hyper or impulsive. They might have some hyperactivity and impulsivity, but not enough to meet criteria in that realm of the diagnosis. So then the other subtype, the next subtype of ADHD would be the combined. And so those are the kids that do have the predominantly inattentive symptoms, but they also have these hyperactive impulsive symptoms at a level that's really significantly impairing. So these are the kids that are hyperactive and not paying attention in your classroom setting or on the playground or on the baseball field or wherever they might be. The last subtype of ADHD is the hyperactive impulsive presentation. That's a lot more uncommon. You're not going to see that as much, that kids are bouncing off the walls, but they're paying attention very, very well while they do it. So there are those kids that can do that. So they're really impulsive and they are hyper, but at the same time, they can sit and focus on a non-preferred task for a long period of time. They're not distractible. And so they don't meet criteria for inattentive symptoms. So let's talk about some of those symptoms. I'm going to try real quick, just give me a little bit of patience. I have everybody's like little Zoom screen over here, and I can't see my whole slide. And I seem to have also lost my cursor. So I don't know what's happening here.
Able to have an option in your upper right hand window. There should be like a little gray option that says view.
There is, but I think because I'm sharing my screen as a slideshow, my cursor is gone.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I can't do that. So let me see here. Hold on, everybody. I'm escaping. I'm gonna use my cursor to fix this. But when I say speaker, it won't show me, Megan. It'll only show you.
That should be okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, so I'm just gonna watch you. I'm going to watch you while I talk. Okay, so the inattentive symptoms of the ADHD, predominantly inattentive presentation, or for the combined presentation, there's 9 different options. And so you have to have 6 or more required to have an actual diagnosis. You might have like subdiagnostic level difficulties, but you do have to have 6 or more of these to have a diagnosis. And so I'm just going to, you can see them on your screen. I'm just going to kind of read through them pretty quickly so that you are at least familiar with them. So The individual often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in their schoolwork, or if they're adolescent or adult at work or during other activities. So they are these people who, we all make careless mistakes sometimes, right? Of course. But this is happening a lot in their work, right? So they overlook details, their work is inaccurate, even though they might know the material. Then they often have difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. So during a lecture in class, it's going to be really difficult. You might notice them zoning out during conversations. They can't stay focused during lengthy reading assignments. Or even for some kids that are more severe, play activities also, as it mentions, they have a difficult time sustaining their focus. Even when they're playing, they're off to something else here and there, and they're kind of all over the place with their attention. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. So it is important with ADHD kids to get their attention first, right? So make sure that they're looking at you, you have established eye contact. Otherwise, it is challenging for them to really listen to you. And so a lot of times you may feel like they're just not paying any attention to you. Even if they're kind of looking at you, their eyes start to wander a little bit, like they start to look to the side, and you can tell they've started to think about something else. Often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork or chores or duties in the workplace for an older individual. So they're going to start a task. They're very, motivated. They'd like to get it done, but then something else happens. They lose their focus on it. They get sidetracked. They get distracted, and that task just doesn't get finished. And then the last one on this slide often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. So the individual is disorganized. They probably have a really difficult time keeping things in order in like their room or their desk. Their backpack is probably really messy. They might have papers from previous semester or maybe even previous years in the bottom of their backpacks. So they really have a difficult time with organizing materials, but then also with organizing their time. So in terms of time management, and they might forget to turn things in. They actually might even do an assignment on their virtual learning and then forget to hit submit, right? Like they have not got all the steps kind of down. Then also there's several others. So often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. So this is for most kids schoolwork, right? So it might be a big fight to get them to do homework. It might be really challenging to get them to sit down, get everything out, and work through to completion. Anything that is going to be a little bit more intensive, a little bit boring, maybe take a little bit longer, might be something that they avoid or resist or at least complain about. Often loses things necessary for tasks or activities. So these are the kids that never have a pencil when they need it. They can't find their books. Those teenagers who are constantly losing their cell phones. The kid who always leaves their glasses at school or leaves them at home when they need them in the other place. The next one is that they're often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. So obviously that's, the car drives by, a dog is barking, the sister walks through the room, these kinds of things are really distracting for them. Maybe smells. So if you're cooking dinner, they're distracted by that. They hop up out of their homework chair and come running into the kitchen. Oh, what do I smell? What are you fixing? Right. So they can be really distracted. They can't filter any of that out. And then for the older students, it may actually be that they are more distracted by their thoughts. Right. So they have these random thoughts that are popping in to their mind all the time. And that's really distracting to them. And then the last of the 9 inattentive symptoms is that they're often forgetful in daily activities. So you have to give constant reminders, even though your routines are the same day in and day out. So, it's always the same routine for getting ready for school in the morning. And it's always the same routine for getting ready for bed at night. But you have to always remind them. Right. So they're not able to do all of the tasks to completion on their own. They need a lot of support and guidance in getting that done. Then in terms of the other side of things, the hyperactive impulsive symptoms for ADHD, again, there's 9 symptoms and you have to have 6 or more required for a diagnosis. And so these are, I think, ones that we're more used to looking for in a way. These are the obvious things that we think of when we think of a kid that has ADHD, right? So they're fidgety, they're squirming in their seat, they're leaving their seat, even though they're supposed to be staying in their seat, whether it's a classroom or maybe in a restaurant. They really shouldn't be running around, but there they are. Leading into this third one, they often run about or climb in situations where it's not appropriate. So, maybe you've been in a restaurant and you've seen a kid climbing over the back of the booth, right? I mean, that's really not an appropriate thing that you should probably be doing, but nevertheless, that's what we're talking about, right? Now, in terms of the older students, it is kind of important to consider that you're not going to see so much of this, right? You're not going to have a 15, 16-year-old crawling over the back of a booth in a restaurant, right? You're not going to have them running out of their seat in the middle of class, but they are feeling that, right? So they feel subjectively very restless and they're uncomfortable sitting there, but they can do it because they're older. So the hyperactive impulsive symptoms do tend to diminish as a student gets older, just so you know. They have a little bit more control over their motor activity. Another symptom can be that the child often cannot play or engage in leisure activities quietly. So they're noisy, right? They're very noisy players. When they're playing with their toys, there's a lot of crashing noises and siren noises, and the people are yelling at each other. So they're noisy kind of players. Additionally, they're often on the go. They're acting as if driven by a motor, so they're just never able to really sit still. Right? So they can't really just be calm unless, I do want to say, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but there are circumstances, of course, where a child will not be acting like this, even if they often are, right? So if they're very tired or they're sitting in front of the TV or, something like that, they'll be able to be still. So don't get the impression that that's 100% of the time. Excuse me. So they often talk excessively, they're chatterboxes. They often blurt out answers before the question is completed or before an instruction is totally given. They've already started the task. They might complete other people's sentences. They blurt out into the middle of a conversation. And they also have difficulty waiting their turn. So maybe waiting in line is very frustrating for them. They get really impatient about that. They also might have a difficult time waiting their turn in like a board game or a card game. It's difficult to kind of wait for everybody else to go and get back to them. And then the last hyperactive impulsive symptom is that they often interrupt or intrude on other people. So they might, of course, butt into conversations like we were saying before. They might like reach across and start grabbing your things, right? Just start using somebody else's belongings without asking permission. So in the classroom, walking up to another student and just taking the markers they were using off their desk, for example, or reaching over to their seatmate and just grabbing their pencil because they can't find their own. Okay, so those are the symptoms that we're talking about for ADHD. And there's other things that are really important to know in terms of making a diagnosis of ADHD. So several of the symptoms that we just went over, so several of those 18 have to have been present prior to age 12. So during childhood, we have to have seen some of those symptoms that were of a level of impairment. You don't have to necessarily have had enough to meet criteria for a diagnosis before age 12, but some of it had to have been present. And then we also have to see some of the symptoms at a level of impairment in 2 or more settings. So if only the parents see it at home and nowhere else, it doesn't happen at school, it doesn't happen in sports or music lessons or any place else, then I can't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Same thing if it's only happening at school. So if the child is inattentive in the school setting and fidgety and so on, but nowhere else, then again, I can't diagnose ADHD. So it does have to be present in 2 or more settings. Also, symptoms really must clearly interfere with functioning. So, everything is on a continuum, right? So sometimes we're all distractible, sometimes we're all fidgety, sometimes we're all disorganized, but it's all about the level of impairment, how extreme it is, and if it's interfering. So I don't know if you remember disorder when we talked about that diagnosis. It's talking there's a condition that impairs functioning, right? And so there has to be some impairment. Usually what we're going to be seeing is impairment in academics, right? So it's interfering with the child's ability to learn, complete work, that sort of thing. But it also can impact their social functioning because they might be unaware of other people's personal space, right? So they're in their friends' faces and they're grabbing their toys, they're taking their ball on at recess, they're not picking up on nonverbal cues because they're just too distracted by everything else going on. And so it could lead to some difficulties with making and keeping friends. So typically symptoms do vary on the context. So ADHD is a context dependent diagnosis or context dependent experience, I guess you would say. The diagnosis is always there, but it's not always going to be as impacting. So, for example, in an assessment setting, like in my office, it's very quiet. There's very few distractions. We're working one-on-one. And so I'm not always going to see the difficulties to the same level, right, to the same extreme. So that's why it's really important that I have information from the parents, from the teachers, from tutors, anybody that's working with a child in another setting, because I just may not actually see it in this sort of a setting. Also, if you have something that the child's doing that's really a preferred activity, they really enjoy what they're doing, maybe it's even their favorite thing to do, then you may not see symptoms of the ADHD. So a lot of times I will hear parents say, well, I know my child doesn't have ADHD because he can sit on video games for 6 hours and he does not have any trouble paying attention to that. In fact, he doesn't even remember to get up and eat. Or, oh, well, my daughter definitely doesn't have ADHD because she can read her favorite book for 2 hours before bed and it's, no problem at all. So that's actually part of what we're looking for. That's actually indicative of ADHD, is that a student can hyper focus on things that they are really interested in. So their preferred activities, they can hyper focus on, almost to the exclusion of being aware of anything else around that. So they're so zoned in that they do forget. They forget to go to the bathroom. They forget to eat. They forget that it's 3 a.m. and maybe they should have gone to bed already, but they've been playing video games with their friends and they lost track of time, right? So they're just because a student can focus well on something that's engaging doesn't mean they don't have ADHD. The true test of attention is, can you focus when it's not interesting? We can all focus when it's interesting, but the true test is, can you if it isn't? So keep that in mind too when you're kind of considering if your child or someone a friend's child or something might potentially need to be assessed. So in terms of prevalence of ADHD, so how pervasive is this issue really? It occurs in most cultures in about 5% of children. So it's pretty consistent, and about 2.5% of adults. So the math isn't exactly right for what I'm about to say, but what we've kind of learned is that about 25% of kids outgrow ADHD. So there is always hope that that might happen. So you're going to see, let's say that you have a child and they have ADHD combined presentation. So they have the inattentive symptoms as well as hyperactive impulsive, and this child is maybe 8 years old. So then as that child is getting a little bit older, maybe 13, 14, 15 years old, you're seeing a lot less of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Okay, but the inattention is still there. If that child is going to outgrow ADHD, then they're probably going to do that more around age 18, 19, 20. Okay, so 75% of people do not outgrow it, right? But 25% do. And there's no way to tell when the child is little, are they going to be one who outgrows it or not? We just don't know. There's not a way to tell that. If you have a pretty big history in the family of ADHD and you can kind of look back and say, well, most of the people did outgrow it, then your child has a better chance of outgrowing it than a child who, everyone in their family, it's been lifelong for, or everyone with the diagnosis anyway. So is ADHD a new thing? No, it's definitely not a new thing. So we've known about ADHD and it's been recognized and documented by medical science since 1902. And we also are very clear based on brain imaging studies that it is a brain-based disorder. So because it's a brain-based disorder, the most effective treatment is a brain-based or biological treatment. So stimulant medication is considered the first line treatment for ADHD. You'll see some of the stimulant medications listed there. So Concerta, Ritalin, Vyvanse, Adderall, some of those are kind of the most commonly prescribed or the ones you'll hear and recognize the names of, but there are many others actually. And then the non-stimulant medication treatments are typically considered second line because they really are not as effective. Strattera was just introduced as a first line option, even though it's a non-stimulant. But just anecdotally, the clients that I have seen who tried Strattera did not have success with it. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some people. It must, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't have been moved up to a first line option. Then also in terms of kind of treating the symptoms of ADHD coaching or executive function training, like you might go to La Jolla Learning Works for, is helpful in a lot of the different areas of difficulty, right? So teaching organizational skills, study strategies, time management, planning out, how do you do a larger assignment? So these are things that don't come naturally to kids that have ADHD. And so teaching them very explicitly how to do these things can be really helpful. In terms of accommodations for ADHD, so treatment or interventions are things that we're doing to try to actually change and make it better. Okay, you'll see that throughout the presentation today. Accommodations are things that are not actually going to build the skills, but they're going to make it easier for the person to show their true abilities, right? And kind of accommodate for the weaknesses. So accommodations for ADHD will include extended time for exams because it's really difficult for them to sustain their focus in the allotted time. So they need the extra time so they can keep refocusing and coming back to the task and be able to finish the exam. They often won't finish in time if it's time limited. Preferential seating is really helpful because if they're right up front, right next to the point of instruction and seated by the teacher, then there's fewer distractions, right? So if the whole class is behind them, then all the kids that are shifting around or dropping their paper or whatever they might be doing are less distracting to the student. Also, right there by the teacher can always maybe put a hand on the shoulder or on the desk to remind the student, remember to focus, right? So if they're close to the teacher, it's easier to do that. And we always want to minimize distractions during schoolwork time and homework time. And then, of course, build in some movement breaks, particularly for those kids that are more hyperactive. So letting them step outside for a minute or go sharpen their pencil or get a drink of water, take something to the office, right? So that they have the opportunity to move and they don't get a little bit too squirrely and end up falling out of their chair, right? That happens. Okay, so do we have any questions about ADHD before we move on?
We do have a couple really good questions about ADHD, and I appreciate your insights here. There's some, I was not aware that there was such science and statistics around the numbers of students or percentage of individuals that can outgrow ADHD. That's really fascinating. Someone wanted to know just in general, at what age you think it's appropriate to talk to a child about a diagnosis of this sense. And I'm thinking that question kind of means also going back to your terms in the beginning of how do you frame it? How do you talk to a kid about this, especially on the younger side? And then, thinking of when it's appropriate to actually, maybe use a term ADHD and, start to explain it in a more like scientific way.
Right. So my belief, and most others like me who make diagnoses would say that you want to start talking about the child as soon as you know. Okay, so you're not going to have like a 3 or 4 year old who's diagnosed with ADHD probably, and they're not going to understand it. But as young as 6, 7 years old, you can start talking to them about it because kids will label their experience if we don't label it for them. Okay, so if we don't say, how it's hard to sit still and how sometimes you get in trouble at school because you're not paying attention, or it might be kind of difficult to get your work done sometimes because you're thinking about other things or you're kind of distracted. Well, that's part of your learning and and it's called ADHD, right? Everybody learns differently, and part of how you learn is called ADHD. And so it's very simplified for them, but if we don't label it accurately for them, they'll start labeling it as, well, it must be that I'm not as smart, or it must be that I'm actually dumb, right? Or it must be that I'm not a school person. School is not my thing, or, whatever it might be. They will label it themselves. And that goes for all the diagnoses that we're going to talk about today, not just ADHD. But I think that it's important that we give them an accurate term for what their experience is, because it validates their experience for one thing, right? It's not just this weird thing you're out there by yourself experiencing all alone, right? It has a name. It's a real thing. Other people experience it too. And this is kind of what it means. And this is, when you experience this, it's because of that. And it doesn't mean you aren't smart. It doesn't mean you aren't talented. It doesn't mean, that you are not this wonderful and amazing kid. It's just part of how you learn. And I think that if we make it very matter of fact and we're real upbeat and positive about it, it's actually very empowering to them to have a name to put with their experience.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thinking of a child who's diagnosed with ADHD, do you have any tips for like more general living advice on raising a kid with ADHD, not necessarily, school related?
Right. So just kind of in the home setting, right?
Yep.
So definitely, you want to set very clear expectations, right, about what's allowed in your home and what isn't in terms of behavior, especially if you have a hyperactive, impulsive kid, because, sometimes they get a little bit more out of control, especially with siblings. So you want to make it very clear what's expected and what isn't. And structure, routine, predictability is really, really helpful for kids that have ADHD. So they, if they know what to expect, then it's really great for them. You also want to build in organizational strategies for them. So, let's say that they have a lot of trouble cleaning their room, right? That's a very overwhelming task to a kid with ADHD. You say, go clean your room. It's very overwhelming to them. They don't know where to start that. They can't organize that kind of task. So if you can break it down for them and say, okay, let's walk into your room together and take a look at what needs to be done. And okay, so I can see that you have a pile of laundry that needs put away, for example, right? So let's start with that. Even though the whole rest of the room is a nightmare, let's just start with the laundry that needs put away. So if you have a young child, you can actually label their dresser. This is where the pants go, this is where the shirts go, this is where the socks go, and so on, so that all they have to do is look on the outside of the drawer and it tells them, right? If your child is also dyslexic and they have some difficulty reading those words, then put the word and also a picture of the pant or the shirt or whatever it might be. And then, so you kind of created an easier organizational strategy for them. And then once the clothes are all put away, you go to the next thing that needs, okay, now we're going to pick up all the action figures, right? And you need a bin, you need a place for everything, and you want to label it, and that will help them because they can't naturally be organized. So you have to kind of teach them in a very structured way how to do that. Is that?
Oh, that's great. I was just going to say, to kind of piggyback on that, for the kids who can read, at least simple terms, having checklists for them in places, like in the bathroom and be on the mirror of what they need to do in the morning, or, on the back of their bedroom door, so that as they're leaving the room, they know what to do, or maybe it's on the refrigerator, just having these reminders in different places so that they know what to do on that like visual perspective too.
Right. Absolutely. Those kinds of things are really helpful for the daily routines. Right. So they do get forgetful. So if you have checklists, the only thing is that a lot of times they'll forget to check the checklist. Right. So just reminding them to check their checklist. Right. So when they come out and you say, are you ready for school? And you can look at them until they're not. Then you can say, okay, check your checklist one more time for me to make sure. Right. So just kind of the prompting and redirecting and that sort of thing. Also, as I mentioned earlier, at home, you definitely want to make sure that you have established eye contact before your child to do anything, before you tell your child to do something. And also, you always want to make sure that they are not looking at a screen when you talk to them, because they really will not hear anything you say. And that's true for most children, whether they have ADHD or not. The visual system is stronger than all our other systems. So if you're visually engaged with something, then you're not going to hear as well. Okay, because that kind of overpowers everything else that's going on. So you want to make sure that if you need to have a real conversation or tell them some instructions, that the screen is off and that they're looking at you.
I always like the check too of just, what did I say? Can you tell me back what I asked you to do, so that you know that they actually processed it, and it helps them process it more to go through that response too. Another question that came up here that I actually had too was thinking of this idea of a child outgrowing ADHD. Is it a matter of really outgrowing it, or is it a matter of like the impact being different or the context being different? Thinking like, will a fidgety kid just still struggle with like, say, social relationships outside of school, or executive functioning in the workplace, with the things that used to impact them at school, no longer being relevant? Or is it truly that they like outgrow the symptoms?
Yeah. So it truly is for that 25% that they outgrow it. So as their brain is continuing to develop and the hormones are changing, and all of that is happening kind of in those later teen years, their brain changes enough that they literally have outgrown it.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And the last question I have here, and then we'll move on so that we can get to the rest of your topics here, just is if you have any specific help on like bedtime routine, which I know can be a struggle. I have a toddler, so it's always a struggle, but what do you do with bedtime routine for, a child with ADHD, or maybe they have a hard time winding down?
Yeah. So, I think every kid is a little bit different in that. What that means that their bedtime routine is difficult. Some kids, it means their bedtime routine takes 3 hours. Some kids, it just means that they won't stay in the bed. So I don't know for this particular person. And you always also want to, talk with someone who can help you with your specific child, right? So today, we're just trying to kind of give some general information about what these different diagnoses kind of look like, and what their causes are, and so on. But someone who really can take the time to talk more about, like, what do you mean, like, what's the problem with bedtime? But certainly you want to have routine, you want to have like a certain number of things that are going to happen, right? So we read one story, and then we turn off the light and listen to one song, and then mom leaves, right? So, or whatever it might be, but it needs to be very well established ahead of time. So, and it's helpful to have the child involved in that process. If it's a matter of they won't stay in their bed because they're just too wound up, then you can try lavender and warm milk, and things to just kind of calm them. And I mean, that's the best I can say, without knowing more details about the particular child's behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Thank you, Christina.
You're welcome. Okay, so now we're going to jump into dyslexia. We're going to talk about what it is not, because there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings about what dyslexia is. We're going to talk about the underlying processing, the prevalence, and then some interventions and accommodations, again, just kind of at a high level. So dyslexia is literally trouble with words. So dyslexia is Greek, and dys means difficulty and lexia means words. So it is literally trouble or difficulty with words. So it's a language-based disorder, and primarily it affects the reading at the level of the word. So accurate or fluent word recognition, being able to decode new words, and being able to kind of isolate sounds to spell new words. And then secondarily, comprehension can be affected. So dyslexia, again, is at the level of the word. It's not at the level of comprehension. But if you're really laboring over how to sound out each and every word, and it's very disfluent and it's taking a lot of time, of course, your comprehension is going to be impacted. It's interesting, though, because a lot of kids with dyslexia comprehend what they've read way better than we would expect them to, based on how poorly we have heard them read, right? So if they read out loud to us, and it sounds very inaccurate, but yet they can mostly tell you what happened. So it's a pretty interesting process there. They have such good verbal comprehension or verbal intelligence and background knowledge, and they use a lot of cues from the words they did get and pictures and so on. So they have a lot of different strengths and strategies that they use for comprehension. But if you have a really, really impaired reader, obviously comprehension can be affected. Also with dyslexia, we'll see difficulty memorizing multiplication facts and sequences of math steps. So it can be difficult to memorize, how do I long divide? Like, what am I supposed to do with long division? And how do I regroup? And, those sorts of things can be difficult for them to memorize. And it does say multiplication facts, and that is really much harder for them than addition and subtraction. Directionality can also be a big difficulty. So, left and right, greater than, less than signs, letters that look similar, B's, D's, P's, Q's, things like that. The directionality is a challenge for them to be able to identify which is which. And then the ability to tell time on an analog clock. So a clock with hands, for some reason, is also very difficult for individuals with dyslexia oftentimes. Again, not always. Everybody is different, but that's pretty common. And then word finding abilities. So you'll see that kids are like, wait, the thing, what's it called? Oh, the thingy, or they might use words a little bit incorrectly, might pronounce them a little bit incorrectly, or they might make up their own words. Common sayings come out a little bit off, a little, little worded wrong. So it can affect oral language skills as well as written language skills, but primarily dyslexia is considered a reading disorder. It is found equally often in boys and girls. So there's some misconception that it's more often found in boys, and that's not the case. So dyslexia is not a visual problem. Individuals with dyslexia don't see letters or words backward, and the reason that they flip B's and D's and such is more to do with the directionality, and also the fact that they don't have an innate sense of what the letter means, right? So everything is memorized. So if you're trying to memorize every single letter and every sound that goes with it, and it's just really not meaning anything to you, that connection, that visual verbal association doesn't have a strong meaning, then it's easier to get them confused. Sometimes you will potentially have someone say, oh, you should go to this optometrist, or you'll go to an optometrist. They'll say, oh, well, I treat dyslexia with vision therapy. That makes no sense. I just want to say that clearly. That doesn't make sense. You can't treat dyslexia with vision approaches because it's not a vision problem. It has nothing to do with your visual processing. So that doesn't make sense. Also, dyslexia is not a lag in development. So dyslexia is lifelong. You're not going to outgrow it. With remediation, you definitely can improve to the point where maybe it's not even really impacting your reading anymore, but you're still always going to be dyslexic. And dyslexia is not due to laziness. In fact, dyslexic people have to work very, very hard to get lesser results a lot of times than their non-dyslexic peers. And dyslexia is not responsive to standard classroom teaching methods. I think that anyone with a dyslexic student knows this, but those on here who might just be learning about dyslexia out of interest, or you're at the beginning of, a diagnosis, whatever it might be, it really is just fact. I mean, regular classroom teaching is not going to work for a dyslexic student who's trying to learn to read. So even in a special ed class, so like resource support, pull out, that kind of thing, working with the reading specialist at the public school, the reading gains are minimal unless that particular person is using an Orton-Gillingham based, and we're going to talk about that, an Orton-Gillingham based or dyslexia specific kind of remediation program, which is very rare. So it's not impossible. There are some schools in San Diego, a few public schools that do have people who are trained and are administering the correct program with dyslexic students, but it's very rare. Megan, have you seen other than that? I mean, it's pretty rare, right? Like most of the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's rare.
So what if it's not a visual problem? What is the problem? What is the underlying processing problem for dyslexic individuals? So it's phonological processing. So phonological processing is that component of language that helps you to process the individual sounds of speech. So you're segmenting words into their individual sounds. So for example, cat is cat, right? Blending sounds together to make words is the other component of phonological processing. So when you're reading, you see the letter CAT and you know that's cat, and then you can put it together and say, oh, that's cat, right? So you're blending those sounds together. Good phonological processing is really crucial to develop a good foundation for efficient reading and spelling. If you do have difficulty with phonological processing, you're not going to be an efficient reader or speller. So the core deficit within phonological processing for about 88% of people with dyslexia is the specific skill of phonological awareness. And so this is the ability to really appreciate that the words are made up of smaller sound units, like syllables and rhyming endings. So individuals who have dyslexia a lot of times do have difficulty with the concept of rhyming because they just don't process that. And sometimes they really don't even hear syllables. They just hear a word, right? They don't kind of understand the concept of syllables, though that is a bit easier for some kids than phonemic awareness, which is like another level of complexity. And that's being able to recognize that words are actually comprised of sounds. So not just syllables, but individual sounds. So sometimes I'll see a kid and they can say, when I say, okay, what sounds do you hear in cowboy? They can say cow and boy, right? But they don't really hear the cow, boy, like they don't hear the individual sounds. It's very difficult. And then other times, I'll have a kid and I ask them, well, what sounds do you hear in house, for example? And they look at me like I'm a crazy person. Like, what are you saying? It's just house. They don't hear those individual sounds within the word. They just hear the word as one kind of sound unit, if that makes sense. So the prevalence of dyslexia is, it's unclear exactly because you're going to see some different numbers, but overall we can tell it's a lot. So Sally Shaywitz, who is really considered kind of like a huge expert in dyslexia, you definitely want to read anything that Sally Shaywitz reads. She did an extensive longitudinal study, and 20% of the students that she was studying over this period of time had a language-based reading disorder with that core deficit in phonological component of language. So that speaks to 20% of the student population likely is dyslexic. The International Dyslexia Association states on their website that they range 15 to 20% of the population has dyslexia. So it's still a lot. Understood.org, which is a really great website, by the way, for any kind of learning disability. There's a lot of good parent information there. They indicate 5 to 17% of the population. So they've just taken all the different research studies, and kind of included the range that most of them might say. So, 5% is much lower than what we really think is accurate. I personally think it's much closer to the 20% than the 5%. And then the DSM-5, which again is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, says that 5 to 15% of school-age kids across all languages and cultures have a specific learning disorder of some sort. And then other sources indicate that about 80% of those students, so 80% of the 5 to 15%, have a reading disorder most often caused by dyslexia. So that's going to be a little bit maybe smaller percentage than what Sally Shaywitz had indicated. But again, however you look at it, it's a lot of people, as many as 1 in 5. So think about how many kids that is in a classroom, many of whom are unidentified. So that can sometimes be helpful too. If you do have a child who's been diagnosed with dyslexia, I often will tell the child that it's really common and that it's like 1 in 5 people. So I usually ask them, how many kids are in your class? And then they tell me. And then I say, that means, however many. So let's say there's 25 kids in their class. Well, that means there's probably 5 kids in your class with dyslexia and you just didn't even know. And they'll say, well, I know so-and-so, sometimes they're aware that because one student might already be diagnosed and be pretty good at advocating and trying to educate his or her peers. But a lot of times they don't. And they just are like, really? Like, I'm not the only one. And so it can help them feel, again, like it's a little bit more of a common issue. Like it's more normal and they don't feel as isolated. So here's some other things to know about dyslexia. So there is single deficit dyslexia and then double deficit dyslexia. So double deficit dyslexia means that the student has difficulties in both phonological awareness and rapid naming. So rapid naming is the quick recall of well-learned information. So sight words that the child has learned well, associating a sound with a letter, basic math facts, that sort of thing. So if a child does have difficulty with rapid naming, then there's kind of a lag between when they see the information on the page and when their brain provides it for them. So it interrupts their fluency. So a student with double deficit dyslexia has difficulty in both those areas. And those are the kids that are going to have the most difficulty learning to read. Dyslexia is a primarily genetic brain-based disorder. So from what I've seen, if you have a parent who's dyslexic, each of their children has about a 50% chance of also being dyslexic. That's why you want to be watching your children at a very early age to see if they are having any difficulty with rhyming or memorizing the alphabet, associating sounds with letters, that kind of thing, so that you can intervene early if so. Then it is not a new thing either. So ADHD is not new and dyslexia is not new. It's actually been described by physicians since the late 1800s. And interestingly, we actually have more research on dyslexia than any other condition that affects children. So the NIH has so many research studies and grants and has for many, many decades looking at dyslexia. So we really do know a lot about it. One interesting thing is that the brain activity of someone with dyslexia is different from a non-dyslexic individual while they're decoding nonsense words. So these are the words that they haven't learned. They're not sight words. They have to decode them. Okay, they're not accurate like actual English words, but they are phonetically accurate, so you can decode them. So a proficient reader is sounding out or decoding words using mostly the left side of their brain, so the language-based centers of their brain, while a dyslexic reader is actually primarily using the right hemisphere of the brain. So they are learning to read and they are reading in a way that is very inefficient and much less accurate. So it isn't that someone with dyslexia can't read. Many times they can read. It's just that it is laborious. It takes a lot of effort and concentration. They might get really tired reading, and it's just not efficient. And they make a lot more mistakes because of the parts of the brain that are being activated for that task. And those are really not the parts that are most useful. So dyslexia remediation, like you would do at La Jolla Learning Works, is actually building up the processing for dyslexic individuals so that their brain then starts to process more in the way that a non-dyslexic reader would be processing. So it's a lot more efficient and accurate. So brain image findings, like I just mentioned, with the left and right hemisphere areas being activated, are consistent in all ages and in all native languages. So we know dyslexia spans the globe, basically. So some interventions for dyslexia are primarily going to be remediation, right? So multisensory, explicit, systematic, direct language-based instruction is really, really crucial. So Orton Gillingham, Wilson, Slingerland, Barton. So these are some of the programs. There are others as well. But Megan, I think you use Wilson, right?
Yes, we do. We use Wilson, and we use some of the aspects of Lindenwood Belt. Not usually the full LIPS program, but we definitely integrate some of the parts of Lindenwood Belt too.
Yeah, cool. Right. So that's the kind of program that is going to be effective for dyslexic students, right? As I mentioned, regular instruction in the classroom is not effective, but we have all this data. We have decades and decades and thousands of research articles on dyslexia. We know this is what works, right? But I also think that it's crucial to know going into it. And I don't know, Matt, you probably talk to parents about this when they start, but you really have to do this work consistently and intensively if you're trying to change the brain. So you can't really expect to do tutoring once a week and see any kind of real progress or lasting change. Twice a week, I think, is really minimum. If you can do 5 times a week, then that's the best. Obviously, you can't really do 5 times a week during the school year for most kids, but during the summertime, you can do an intensive program and try to really make a ton of progress in that period of time. So if you're changing the brain, it has to be done intensively or the brain just isn't going to change. Also, you want the program to be done one-on-one or a very carefully matched small group, like maybe 1 or 2 other students that are at the very same level as they go through the program. And then these programs that I mentioned do this, but if you're looking at other programs, you just really want to make sure that the program develops phonemic awareness in a systematic way. So if you are working with a public school district and you're asking them what program are they going to use with your child, you just have to make sure that what they are planning to do has scientific backing, and in its development, it does prove that it develops phonemic awareness in a systematic way. The other thing in terms of interventions would just be to treat coexisting attention, behavior, or emotional disorder so that they can really benefit from the remediation that they're receiving. Accommodations for dyslexia, honestly, there are many, 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 but I'm just going to list 3 big ones here. So audiobooks, text to speech, and speech to text, and then extra time to complete tests and assignments, especially if they're heavy on reading. So again, there's many, many things that you can do for dyslexia. We know a lot about it. Do we have any questions about dyslexia?
I don't have anything in here just yet.
Okay. Well, I noticed that I was talking too long about ADHD and dyslexia, so I'm going to move on. And then if some pop in, we can get back to those. So dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is not just bad handwriting, but we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. So it's a handwriting disorder, and it really involves the impairment in the process of writing. It's not just the poor product at the end, it's the process. Like the physical act of handwriting is impaired. So at the core of dysgraphia is a problem with motor planning, and motor coordination is also involved there. So when we're looking at a child's writing and trying to figure out if that child has dysgraphia, we're looking for a number of different things. So poor spacing within and between words, variability in the letter size and proportion. So for example, a T should be a taller letter than an E, but if the E is just as big as the T or even bigger, then there's a proportion issue, right? A child may form the same letter several different ways within the same sentence. There's a variable baseline, so they're not writing straight on the line. Their lines kind of go wavy, their line of writing within the space. And then their margins might be crowded. Usually the right margin is more crowded than the left, but both can be unbalanced. And then we also can see illegible letter formation, just a general messy appearance because they're erasing too much, crossing out, writing over, that kind of thing. And then they often will write with an inconsistent pressure. Their rhythm is inconsistent. So they're pressing hard in some places, very light in other places. You'll also see an inappropriate mix of upper and lowercase letters, poor spatial organization on the page, a very slow writing speed, and their handwriting is non-automatic, meaning they have to really think about all aspects of writing and concentrate on the physical act of putting their ideas down on paper. So where do I put my pencil? Where do I start the letter? Where do I go next? And so then they do end up kind of forgetting some of the other aspects of writing. Okay, so they might make mistakes in punctuation, capitalization, spelling, even though they know the way to do it, there's just not enough brain power to think about all that at once. So here's an example of a dysgraphic writing sample. So you can see that the first and second lines are running into each other. So there's a spatial issue there. Also, the A in name on the first line is formed very differently than the A in am just under it on the second line. So, again, variable letter formation. You can see that I think on the second line it says, and I am by, maybe. It's hard to say for sure, but let's say that's a B and a Y. Poor letter formation. We can't tell, right? The sizing isn't really quite right. The descenders are not really dropping down. We have some capital L's in here, they should be lowercase. The T's are formed a little bit unusually. The F in the middle of the page you can see is a little unusual. So you can get a sense also that the letters are very large, right? So it's just hard to read. Other things to know about dysgraphia include that it's not the same as a specific learning disorder in written expression. However, in order to code it, sometimes individuals will qualify under that. Okay, so they might qualify an IEP under that. They might code it for insurance purposes, like an occupational therapist might code it under that, just because it's not in the DSM-5. So it's not an official diagnosis in the DSM-5, even though it's widely recognized. Everybody knows dysgraphia is real. But a specific learning disorder in written expression is a different thing. So dysgraphia is the physical act of handwriting, and the disorder of written expression is looking more at the content, right? So are you spelling right? Are you getting the right grammar? Are you using punctuation accurately? Are your thoughts organized? That kind of thing. We don't really know the prevalence of dysgraphia, unfortunately, because we don't have a lot of research on it, but it is estimated to affect between 5 and 20% of students. I would say more than that if you're looking at physicians, right? Handwriting. You can't read a physician's handwriting. Who knows what they're saying? And then it often co-occurs with ADHD and other learning disorders. So it's possible to have dysgraphia and not anything else, but it's much more common to have dysgraphia and ADHD or dyslexia particularly. So interventions can include occupational therapy and the program Handwriting Without Tears. These are not going to get your child to beautiful handwriting, but it can strengthen the handwriting enough that it might help a little bit with legibility when they are required to write. With dysgraphia, primarily you want to accommodate. So type or dictate written work, give them extra time for writing assignments, shorten writing assignments, that kind of thing. Megan, do we have questions about dysgraphia?
So we do have a question that came up previously. If anybody has a question about dysgraphia, go ahead and enter it. There was a question previously for dyslexia. Is there anything you recommend? And I'll let you answer, and then I do have something to add to it. But for specifically remediating the more orthographic type of dyslexia.
Okay, so in terms of remediating orthographic type of dyslexia, I would 100% just defer to Megan, because I don't do any remediation, right? So I would just defer to you as the expert on the remediation itself.
Yeah. So there is a program called Ravo that came out a while ago. We don't really use Ravo specifically, but what's really important with orthographic type dyslexia is doing a lot of work with like the sight words and the visual spatial kind of aspect. So we use some seeing stars techniques from Linda Mood Bell, where there's a lot of air writing and visualizing. We also do a lot of work with students on word parts and breaking down word parts and understanding that there are these different themes that come from Greek and Latin. And so they can start to see patterns in the words. So that's more. And then the other side of it is that there is that lack of automaticity and the fluency. So we do more of the repeated reading and, integrate the fluency practice in there with it too, and making sure there's an emphasis on speed as much as accuracy, sometimes more than accuracy, because that might not necessarily be as much of an issue. I have a question here. Let's see. I found less on how I'm looking at this question. I'm trying to understand what it says. I found less on how to maybe help the impact of dysgraphia. My daughter hates writing but likes typing or voice to text. So I guess that's the idea of just, sharing that. It is really tough, like you said, to get through the handwriting to a point where students actually enjoy writing. We find that too. That I've seen students who actually can do cursive better than printing. So they're out of luck with Common Core in the schools getting rid of cursive, but if they can go through like a Learning Without Tears, Handwriting Without Tears program to get the cursive in, that oftentimes helps. But just going to learn more specifics on using those, spacing on the word. What was that?
Assistive technology.
Thank you. Assistive technology tools. Yep. So learning the typing, learning the voice to text, just get around it. The other thing I wanted to share for dyslexia or dysgraphia in particular is there is an app that you can use on the iPad called Mod Math. And that's something that is designed for students with dysgraphia so that they can get around the handwriting impairments that affect math and lining up numbers, especially in getting into like more complex computations.
Cool. Great, thank you. So dyscalculia, I'm going to try to get through this, the rest of these pretty quickly, but they are really important. So dyscalculia is a math disorder. And basically with dyscalculia, we're talking about math as like a foreign language. So individuals with dyscalculia really don't understand math. It doesn't make any sense to them. Their number sense is poor. They have a lot of difficulty learning math facts and performing accurate calculations. Math concepts really don't make any sense to them. So decoding or deciphering word problems is really challenging. They don't know what's being asked of them. Understanding math phrases, math terminology is very difficult, and they just don't know how to come up with a plan to solve a math problem. So, there can be math difficulties associated with dyslexia and some other things, but dyscalculia is another thing altogether. It's really a huge difficulty with just processing numerical information. It just, again, doesn't make sense to them. So there are a number of different processing deficits that can lead to dyscalculia, and that's visual perceptual, fluid reasoning, working memory, processing speed, a combination of those. And so the underlying processing then is going to help us to understand kind of how to work with that student and try to build up their ability to process and understand math. But we really do need more research because with dyslexia, we know it's phonological processing, but there's really very little evidence that tells us what, if there is one main area that is primary in the development of dyscalculia. So, I've listed 4 areas that can contribute, but it's not as clear cut as dyslexia that there's kind of this one underlying processing area. Genetic predisposition, of course, can play a role. So if, math difficulties run in families, just like most learning challenges do, neurological impairment can play a role, and then environmental factors. But environmental factors, meaning like not a great mathematical foundation in your education, typically that wouldn't create dyscalculia by itself. You would have to basically have a genetic predisposition as well. And then this, kind of kicks it in, so to speak. So that nature and nurture kind of component mixed together. The estimate for prevalence varies from 2 to 10% of the general population has dyscalculia. Intervention. So you want to use a lot of manipulatives. You want to use hands-on strategies so that you can really help the student visualize how numbers relate one to the other, using number lines, multiplication charts, things like that. Small group instruction is, of course, very helpful. Intervention, like you might get from La Jolla Learning Works, and then web-based math practice as well. There's a number of pretty good math programs available online. And then in terms of accommodations, extra time for math tests, just like everything else, extra time. Shorten the math assignments, and then use a calculator. Again, just like with dyslexia, there's a number of other things, like lots of other accommodations, but those are just some key things to be keeping in mind as you get started. Any questions about dyscalculia? I know I went through that really fast.
looking to see. I don't have anything in there yet.
Okay.
But I guess the mod math applies here too.
Mhm.
Just thinking that, that might be helpful for a student to, be able to type and kind of just, space things out nice and neatly. We do a lot of work from the Linda Mood Bell program on Cloud9
On
Math.
Cloud9, yeah.
Yeah, it's very hands-on, based around using the number line and develop number sense and visualization, hands-on learning for math facts, and then getting in with a really systematic approach for word problems so the students can start to conceptualize what the word problems are about and use that, kind of visual spatial sense of like picturing something in their mind to then convert it into an understanding of a number sentence and working through it, a set of steps that they can repeat for any kind of word problem.
Yeah. And again, it's important to know from an assessment what the underlying weaknesses are, right? So if you do have a child and the underlying weakness is visual spatial, then that has to be built up before you can utilize it, right? So some of those strategies that really emphasize a visual spatial approach would have to come later for that student, right? Or others would have, other strategies altogether might have to be used. So that's why, I mentioned it's unfortunate that it's not as clear cut as dyslexia. Right? It's not as clear cut what's really underlying it, but most of the time it is something to do in the visual perceptual realm, but again, not always. So nonverbal learning disorder, you can see from my little picture here, it's really all about perception. Nonverbal learning disorder is, you're going to see it sometimes referred to as nonverbal learning disorder or nonverbal learning disability. Again, disorder and disability have those meanings that we talked about at the beginning, and it's abbreviated either as NLD or NVLD, but it's the same thing either way. So this is a disorder that's really of perception. So visual perception, it's a difficulty with identifying nonverbal information. So seeing patterns, identifying nonverbal concepts, and then applying them to new situations. So being able to really generalize nonverbal learning from one situation to another situation that might be slightly different. So there's a lot of different areas that are a challenge for kids that have NLD and adults as well. It's not something, unfortunately, that's outgrown, but the primary one is going to be the visual spatial awareness. So misperceiving what you see, right? So you can't organize very well what's in your visual field and you don't see it accurately. So for example, in my office, which I can't see myself or I would show you the painting, but there's a little painting and there's some ducks in the painting. And recently I asked a kid with NLD to tell his family and myself how many ducks were in the picture. And I didn't know what he would say, of course, but I was just going to use it kind of as an example that some kids, might not say the right number of ducks, or they might see a duck in a different place than it really is, or whatever. And he said, well, there's 8 ducks. And there's actually 6 ducks. There are not 8 ducks. And this is a teenager. So this is not a little kid who had trouble counting, right? He completely just misperceived how many ducks are in the painting. And he himself was like, why did I say 8? I don't understand. Why did I see 8 ducks, right? So with NLD, that is a big problem, right? Because what they see is not accurate and you don't know what they're seeing. So it's really difficult to help them. Also, they have some difficulty with their sense of where they are in space. So they might not open a door wide enough, right? So instead of it being wide enough to actually walk through, they walk into the door. They can't visualize, so that can even affect their comprehension because they can't visualize what they're reading about. So it isn't as interesting, as engaging. They may not even like to read because it's not very interesting if you can't really visualize and make a movie in your mind of what you're reading. Higher order comprehension is also an issue in terms of identifying the main idea and the supporting details, and then being able to see how those things connect and relate and really one to the other. What is the deal there with the supporting details and the main idea? That's also really challenging. And then social communication is an area that you're going to see a lot with the kids that have NLD. They don't pick up on nonverbal cues. They misperceive the intentions of other people. They can't read on your face if you're irritated. They can't tell if you're joking. They don't pick up on body language. So they can't tell if people are like uncomfortable because they're in their space. Right? So they don't have a sense of space. So they do get too close to people and they can't really read that the other person is uncomfortable. They don't understand humor or sarcasm. They're very literal. And math also is the next thing that can be difficult for them. So a lot of kids with NLD do have dyscalculia because the visual spatial aspect of math. Geometry is particularly difficult, as you might imagine. And then in terms of the executive functions that are impacted with NLD, it's primarily the organization and planning, being able to break things down. So other executive functions that we see more as a problem with ADHD, like inhibition, task initiation, self-monitoring. We didn't really talk about that, but executive functions are a huge problem with ADHD. But with NLD, really, it's just these couple of things. Okay, so sometimes ADHD and NLD will get confused, but if you look at it very closely and at the underlying processing, it's actually quite different. And then poor motor performance is another big area. So very often NLD kids have dysgraphia because the fine motor skills are impaired. They tend to be clumsy. It might take them years to learn how to ride a bike. They might run into walls. So not just not opening doors wide enough and judging that space wrong, but they literally will run into things because they don't know how close they are in space. They might be playing soccer and they kick at the ball and the ball is actually like this far away from them, they just don't have that spatial awareness. Unfortunately, we don't really know how prevalent NLD is because it's so often misdiagnosed as ADHD or something else. Could be misdiagnosed as autism sometimes, or it's just missed entirely and not diagnosed. So we don't really know the prevalence. We do need more research for sure on that. It's not an official diagnosis in the DSM-5, even though it's widely recognized. There are people that are trying to make that change, but at this point in time, the DSM-5 does not have NLD in it. So if you have a child with NLD and you need an IEP, then their qualifying condition is probably not going to be a specific learning disorder, except for those things maybe in the writing or the math that are secondary to the NLD. But their qualifying condition would be the OHI, or other health impaired, which is kind of the classification for other neurological kinds of challenges. So other things that I would like you to know about NLD is that the student is going to experience increased problems as the schoolwork, as math concepts, as socialization, as all that becomes more complex. So a little kid might not really show hardly any symptoms at all. You might not even know there's anything because everything is rote, right? It's just more about memorization and, you walk up to the person and say, hello. Okay, now say please, say goodbye, whatever it is, right? So they've kind of learned and wrote basic social skills, basic math concepts, and memorize those facts. But as that work and life gets more complicated, you start to see a lot more challenges. The strength on the other side of that is that NLD kids usually are very advanced with their verbal skills. So they have a very high verbal IQ, super great vocabulary, they're really articulate. And so that's something to really focus on, right? So that's the strategy you always want to go to with an NLD kid, is you always want to explain everything. You want to talk through everything. You want to really capitalize on those strong verbal skills. Now, a big thing that is unfortunate and important for everybody, I think, to know is that kids that have nonverbal learning disorder are affected throughout their whole, all aspects of their life, right? So this is a pervasive disorder. It's not like with dyslexia where, yes, there are some things in real life like left and right and clocks and things like that that are impaired, but mostly it's, on the academic tasks of reading and spelling. NLD is everything, except for verbal skills. It's kind of pervasive. And so there's a lot of anxiety and depression in kids that have NLD. And there's unfortunately a lot of suicidal ideation as well as attempts and completions. So they're really at great risk of mental health issues because of their NLD and the fact that other people don't understand, right? So there's a lot of negative feedback that they're getting all the time on their behavior and they don't understand it at all. And people just don't understand how to interact with them, or that their motivation is not coming from a place of trying to be manipulative or difficult or anything. They really, really don't understand. So that's something that I think is really important. And under interventions, you'll see I have included here psychotherapy to prevent and address the mental health implications of NLD. But we also want to train these kids in pragmatic language and social thinking. Usually a speech language pathologist can do that successfully. And then training in critical thinking, visual spatial skills, fluid reasoning, so all those nonverbal kinds of processing. If we can try to build that up a little bit more for them. Occupational therapy can be used to strengthen their motor skills and increase their balance. Some kids will also benefit from physical therapy for their gross motor skills. And then again, really emphasizing their strong verbal ability and explain everything, talk through everything for them to kind of give them a model of how they can do that themselves. In terms of accommodations, we're just hoping to minimize the academic challenges in terms of handwriting demands. Of course, you'll want to do some of the math accommodations we talked about as well if they do have that difficulty, which they usually do. Provide assistance with organization for them, just like with ADHD kids. The organizational piece of things is different, just for a different reason. And then follow a structure and routine. So these kids really struggle with change. It's very difficult for them to go beyond the rote. And so we want to make sure that their life is as structured and predictable as possible. Any questions about that?
I was wondering if you recommend vision therapy for nonverbal learning disorder as far as like developing the visual spatial thinking, or do you just lean more into the OT for that?
So in terms of vision therapy, the only things that vision therapy has really been shown in research to be effective for, like consistently in good research, is actual like eye tracking. So the visual motor coordination aspects of vision. So accommodating near to far, convergence, and tracking. So those are really the only three areas that we have really good solid research saying that vision therapy is effective. I know there's a lot of vision therapists that do address visual processing, and some of them are probably awesome, but they're not really doing just vision therapy. Do you know what I mean? Like those optometrists are incorporating more of like academic therapy remediation kinds of strategies. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to be very careful in your interview of an optometrist who wants to do vision therapy for visual perceptual issues about, well, what are they doing? How are they trained? What kind of programs are they using, and make sure that they really understand the full scope of it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
That's got it. Yeah.
Okay. So the last thing just to wrap up is that there can be some other causes of learning struggles aside from those we just mentioned. So sometimes you have visual processing weaknesses that are not severe enough to be a nonverbal learning disorder. Motor impairment is not there. Social skills are fine. It's just the visual perceptual. And so that can lead to difficulties with reading and with math, sometimes also with written organization. ADHD can also create difficulty in organizing written expression because, if your thoughts are disorganized, then it can be hard to put them down on paper. So that, that's kind of secondary though to the ADHD, but it still would be diagnosed individually and addressed in an IEP individually. Dysgraphia can create a disorder of written expression in terms of the grammar and the punctuation, because you just can't think about all those aspects of writing if all you can concentrate on is how to make the letters, right? And then dyslexia can also create a disorder of written expression, specifically in terms of spelling, because dyslexia is diagnosed for the DSM only as a reading disorder. But of course, it significantly impacts spelling. So both have to be diagnosed for the spelling to be recognized as an issue. Does that make sense? You have to actually diagnose, I have to actually diagnose both, even though the disorder of written expression and spelling is secondary to the dyslexia. It's really all because of the dyslexia, but it has to be diagnosed both ways. And then some students do have a math disorder secondary to those effects of dyslexia that we talked about, with memorizing multiplication facts and sequences of steps and that sort of thing. And then also, if you do happen to have a child with weaknesses in working memory or processing speed, that can create challenges in a variety of different ways. And every kid's a little bit different in how they show that. So you also could have a specific learning disorder because of a deficit in working memory or processing speed. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. I'm sorry I had to go through that last half pretty fast. Are there any other questions for me today?
I'm going to hang out for just a few seconds here to see if there's any more questions, but you are so thorough, and you've given such wonderful, clear information. It really, I know it reflects in the way that you write your reports and you evaluate students. I've always appreciated that, the parents have a clear understanding of what the challenges are, and we understand what to do. So thank you so much for all that you do, and for your, communication today, and taking your time to share all this information with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Megan.
We will be sharing Dr. Watson's contact information. We'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this event feel free to forward the email on to anybody you know who would benefit from this information. And so we'll include her information in that so you can know how to connect with her to learn more. Also, Dr. Watson, would it be possible for us to get a copy of this PowerPoint in some format, like we can share with in a PDF format with everybody?
I think I can do that. Yeah, let me just send that. Should I send that to you or to Karina?
Yeah, send that directly to me, and we will we'll get that integrated in with our email so that everybody gets a copy of that too.
Sounds great.
So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much again, Dr. Watson.
Thank you for having me.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
You're welcome. Everybody have a great night.